Hello YouTube. In July of 1518, in the 16th century, in Strasbourg, France, a woman named Frau Trophea went outside and began performing dance steps, which lasted for several days. By the end of the first week, 34 local residents had joined her. Then the crowd of dancers grew to 400 participants. This mysterious attack was called the Dancing Plague or Epidemic of 1518. The 500th anniversary of the beginning of the strange epidemic was celebrated by some publications around the world and TV programs. For example, there was a magazine, Public Domain Review, in the UK. They published an article, The Dance of Saint Vitus in 1518. Its author, Ned Pennant Ria, gave interesting details about the mysterious disease. On a hastily constructed stage in front of the lively Strasbourg horse market, crowds of people danced to pipes, drums, and horns. They jump from one foot to another, spin like a top, and scream loudly. From a distance, it may seem that these are revelers having fun at a carnival, but a closer inspection reveals a more disturbing scene. Their arms dangle and their bodies twitch convulsively. Their clothes are torn and their faces, twisted with flour, are covered with sweat. Their eyes are glazed and expressionless. Blood oozes from swollen feet into leather boots and wooden shoes. These are not revelers, but chorea maniacs, deeply obsessed with dance mania. Listen good, you never know what can happen in our century. I have different opinion about the origin of this epidemic, but we'll get to it. And I'm not the only one, so do my colleagues in Belarus. Korea, not the country, but Korea, a different spelling, is a movement disorder that causes involuntary, irregular, unpredictable muscle movements. The disorder can make you look like you're dancing. Well, the word chorea here comes from the Greek word for dance, like choreography. And it makes you look also like you're restless or fidgety. It was then, in the middle of the summer of 1518, that the chorea tormenting Strasbourg, which was also known as the Dance of the Saint Vitus, reached its peak in front of everyone. It was the deadliest and the best documented outbreak of the epidemic out of 10 similar cases that broke out on the banks of the Rhine and Moselle since 1374. Much evidence of strange events that took place that summer is scattered throughout documents of that time and chronicles written in the following decades and centuries. In one of the chronicles of the 17th century, it was done by the Strasbourg lawyer Johann Schilter. A now lost handwritten poem is quoted. Hundreds of Strasbourgers have started, dancing and jumping, both men and women, in markets, alleys, and streets, day and night, and many of them did not eat anything, until the disease finally left them. The ailment was called the Dance of Saint Vitus. Another chronicle describes a less prosperous end. In the year 1518, people began to be struck by a terrible and strange disease called the Dance of Saint Vitus, and they, seized with madness, danced day and night until finally they fell unconscious and died. The doctor and alchemist Paracelsus visited Strasbourg 8 years after the epidemic and was fascinated by the description of those events. According to his treatise Paramirum, Opus Paramirum, and various chronicles, it all started with one woman. On July 14, Frau Trophea danced on a narrow cobbled street near her wooden brick house. As far as we know, there was no music. She just started dancing. Ignoring her husband's pleas to stop it, she continued to dance for many hours until the sky turned black, and she collapsed to the ground in a twitching heap from exhaustion. The next day she got up on her swollen legs again and danced, not having had time to satisfy her hunger and thirst. On the third day, a growing motley crowd of people, merchants, porters, beggars, pilgrims, priests, nuns, were already reveling in the monstrous spectacle. Frau Trophaea was possessed for 4 to 6 days, after which the frightened authorities intervened and sent her on a cart to Saverne, located 30 miles away. There she could be cured in the sanctuary of Saint Vitus, who they believed had cast a curse on her. But some of those who watched this strange performance arranged by her began to behave in the same way, and after a few days, more than 30 choreo addicts were already dancing, and some were so obsessed that only death could stop them. The more citizens fell ill with this plague, the more desperately this secret council in power at the time tried to control it. The clergy considered the retribution of Saint Vitus, but the councillors preferred to listen to the guild of doctors who declare this dance was a natural disease caused by overheated blood. Therefore, according to humoral theory, the sick should be bled, but instead doctors recommended another treatment that was supposed to rid the victims of a strange disease. To heal, they have to start dancing on their own. The Chronicle of the 16th century, compiled by the architect Daniel Speklin, describes the measure that the council took to do this. Carpenters and tanners were ordered to turn the halls of their guilds into dance floors for a while, as well as to set up a stage in the whores and grain markets in front of the public. In order to keep the dam in motion and thereby continue to their recovery, dozens of musicians were hired to play drums, violins, pipes, and horns, as well as healthy dancers designed to inspire the sick. The authorities hoped to create the best conditions for the dance to exhaust itself. This had horrific consequences. Most viewers were more inclined to trust the supernatural explanation of the dance epidemic than the medical one, so they saw in the frenzied movements of the victims a demonstration of the scale of Saint Vitus's anger. Since everything is not without sin, many also succumb to this mania. In the family chronicle of the Imlands, it is recorded that in a month the dance covered 400 citizens. According to Ned Penantria, the secret council ordered the scaffolding to be dismantled if choreo addicts can't stop their disturbing public peace movements, then let them go out of sight. The council went even further, banning almost all dancing and music in the city until September. In addition, the council ordered that the most possessed be loaded into carts and sent on a 3-day journey to the sanctuary of Saint Vitus, where Frau Trophaea was cured. The priests laid the choreo addicts who continued to twitch like beach fish under the carved wooden image of Saint Vitus. They gave them little crosses in their hands and put red shoes on their feet. They sprinkled holy water on the shoes themselves and their soles and painted crosses with consecrated oil. This ritual, performed under the aroma of thick incense and chanting in Latin, had the desired effect. Soon news of this reached Strasbourg, and more people were sent to Saverne to receive the forgiveness of Saint Vitus. In a week or so, the flow of suffering pilgrims has almost come to nothing, so to say. The epidemic of dancing lasted a little more than a month, from mid-July to late August or early September. When it reached the most, 15 people died every day. It is not known how many lives were taken in total, but if this figure of daily mortality is reliable, then the total number of deaths could reach hundreds. But if it wasn't an angry saint and overheated blood that caused this disease, then what was it? According to Paracelsus, Frau Trophea took her dance marathon deliberately to embarrass Mr. Trophea in order to make the deception as plausible as possible and create the impression of a real illness. She jumped and sang, which was very unpleasant for her husband. After seeing how successful this trick was, other women also started dancing to irritate their husbands, inspired by free, bold, and obscene thoughts. Okay? Paracelsus identified three main types of this dance mania. Chorea lasciva, caused by voluptuous desires without fear and respect. It existed along with chorea imaginativa, chorea caused by imagination because of rage and swearing, as well as chorea naturalis, a much milder form caused by physiological reasons. Although the famous fighter against prejudice, Paracelsus, deserves recognition for looking for the causes of the disease in the head of chorea manix and not in heaven, yet his misogynistic diagnosis now seem somewhat ridiculous. Next, the author reviews accounts of modern historians who claim that the epidemics of chorea that raged in medieval Europe were caused by ergo, a mind-affecting mold fungus that can be found on the stems of raw rye, and which can cause twitching, convulsions, and hallucinations. This condition is also known as St. Anthony's fire. However, historian John Waller debunked the ergo hypothesis in his book on chorea, A Time to Dance, A Time to Die. It was published in 2009. Yes, ergo can cause convulsions and hallucinations, but it also restricts blood flow to the extremities. People poisoned by it simply would not be able to dance for several days in a row. Waller explains the cause of chorea relying on deep knowledge of the material, cultural, and spiritual environment of the 16th century Strasbourg. He opens his book with a quote from the History of Madness in the 16th century Germany by Erich Middelford. I believe it was published in 1999. The madness of the past is not fossils that can be pulled out of their vaults without damage and placed under our modern microscopes. Rather, they resemble jellyfish, which breaks down and dry up after being extracted from the surrounding seawater. According to Waller, the poor of Strasbourg were prepared for an epidemic of hysterical dancing. First of all, they knew the precedent. All outbreaks of chorea in Europe from 1374 to 1518 occurred near Strasbourg. That's along the western borders of the Holy Roman Empire. And this is an area of Alsace, which ends from Germany to France and vice versa. Then favorable conditions were formed for this. By 1518, there was a series of bad harvests, political instability set in, and the appearance of syphilis caused torment and anguish, extraordinary even at that time. All this suffering resulted in hysterical dancing because citizens believed that this could happen. People can be extremely suggestible, and the confidence in the vindictiveness of Saint Vitus was enough for it to appear to them. The minds of the choreographers, so to say, were turned inward, Waller writes, and thrown into the turbulent depths of their most terrible fears. And the other author, Penantrea, he offered this explanation. One of the ways to shed light on the essence of chorea is to consider the trance states that people are seeking today. In different cultures around the world, for example in Brazil, Madagascar, and Kenya, people consciously enter a trance during some ceremonies or involuntarily during extreme stress. In a trance state, they ignore the feeling of pain and exhaustion. Waller describes the spread of the dance plagues as an example of mental contagion and draws a parallel with the epidemic of laughter that occurred in one of the districts of Tanganyika, modern Tanzania, during the difficult post-colonial period in 1963, when a couple of girls at a local mission school started giggling. Their friends followed suit, and now two-thirds of the students were laughing and crying uncontrollably. So the whole school had to be closed. Once home, the students infected their families, and soon all the villages were seized with hysteria. Doctors recorded several hundred seizures lasting an average for a week. You know what? I've seen a small-scale epidemic of laughter many years ago, and I can attest to that. Also, when we speak about trance, people entering trance, and zombie-like conditions, by the way, you should see my videos about this effect among the indigenous people of the Russian Kola Peninsula, and of course the interest of the secret police of the Soviet Union back in 1920s in this incident and of course in this phenomenon. And I will put a link to my previous video in description to this video, because really we know very little about our world and what causes some of the human behavior, even though we have science and investigators and researchers. Anyway, other explanations were given by Discovery Channel and the Endeavor magazine after many unsuccessful attempts to uncover the background of this unusual phenomenon. It is only now that the historian John Waller, professor at the University of Michigan and author of the book Time to Dance, Time to Die, an extraordinary story of the dance plague of 1518, managed to solve the riddle that had occupied the minds of scientists for a long time. These people, Waller writes, did not just shake, shudder, and convulse as if they had fallen into a trance. Their legs and arms moved as if they purposely were performing dance moves. Eugene Beckman, author of the book Religious Dances in the Christian Church and in Popular Medicine, in 1952 drew attention to the biological or chemical causes of such a dance mania. He, like other experts, believed that the underlying cause of such mass phenomena was mold spores caught with bread formed in stacks of wet rye. Yes, De Waller agrees, such mold can cause terrible convulsions and hallucinations, but we talked about it before, but he wanted to add that in no way coordinated movements that can last for many days. This mold cannot do it. In addition, the researcher insists there's absolutely no evidence that dancers wanted to dance. Moreover, they felt despair and fear. One of these fears, originating in the religious legend, was that if one or another person causes the curse of Saint Vitus, the Sicilian martyr of the beginning of the 4th century, canonized by the Church, he will be able to send people to attack in the form of inexplicable attacks of dance, the dance of Saint Vitus. Waller believes that it is the phenomenon known as mass psychogenic illness, a kind of form of mass hysteria, which is usually preceded by unbearable levels of psychological stress that causes such dance epidemics. Victims, the scientist explains, often fall into a state of involuntary trance, which is fueled by psychological stress and the expectation of transition to an imposed state. Thus, in groups of people who are faced with the most severe social or economic troubles, trance can be extremely contagious. Yes, but that's not so in the Kola Peninsula. There is mass hysteria, there's mass zombie-like conditions that people experience, but it's not caused by stress in those areas, but something else. It's very interesting, and I don't belittle his findings, but I think there may be other causes, but we'll get to them also. In the areas around Strasbourg, at least 7 outbreaks of dance epidemics were known in the Middle Ages. Now, in modern history, a case is known on the island of Madagascar, where in the 1840s the inhabitants, according to medical chronicles, danced wildly while in a trance state, being convinced that evil spirits had taken possession of their souls. Scientists always try to explain everything in an extremely primitive way, according to my Belarus colleagues, in order to observe a semblance of rationality. They say that the cause of the dance epidemic was mold or mass hysteria or even fiction. There was nothing like that. However, my colleague Vadim Deruzhinsky, who also studied this phenomenon, personally has no doubt that the reason should be sought not just in the field of psychology, but in the field of managing the behavior of the masses. And this is hypnosis, as well as its deeper and little studied mysterious area, suggestion. Suggestion at a distance without words. And we see a lot of it in the 21st century. And how people take primitive explanations about changes in the world around them, and how they attack others for their beliefs. And I'm speaking about countries that are supposedly claiming themselves to be free. Well, look around and see the very strange behavior, especially in the last few years, especially at the time of the COVID. Anyway, Deruzhinsky personally observed how, at a performance in the city of Minsk in the 1980s, a famous Soviet hypnotist inspired cadets at a military school without words, only by the power of his thought. And the cadets were not in a state of hypnosis. They just went up on the stage. No one communicated with them. And he suggested that the aluminum comb he gives them in his hand was red hot. The cadets threw the cold comb on the floor and shook their hands in pain, and traces of severe burn, huge blisters, appeared on their hand in a second. Think about it. The fact that the comb is allegedly red hot, the hypnotist announced to those present on stage and in the hall after all this. So there was no verbal hypnosis, especially since the cadets were not in a state of hypnosis, but suggestion took place without words, which is called the term suggestion. As the speaker explained, this is the highest form of mastery, and at the same time not explained by science. Deruzhinsky makes an assumption that it is this suggestion that is the cause of the dance epidemic that had engulfed a particular area for a couple of months. It is clear that this is not caused by mold poisoning, since such poisoning should have covered the whole of Europe. And it is clear that the event is connected with a specific area and its specific inhabitants. And in 1518, just near Strasbourg, witches were persecuted. They clashed with local residents. Moreover, the first explanation was the curse, but, as we can understand today, this is not a connection with demons or witchcraft, but a kind of suggestion, because who were the witches of the 16th century? The same psychics as those who had now, at the time that he wrote it, occupied Russian TV channels after the end of the USSR, and a little bit before too, when the freedom came to the country. During the perestroika period instigated by Gorbachev, one such famous psychic, Kashpirovsky, turned the entire population of the USSR into a trance from the TV screen. And if he gave the order to dance all day long, the dance epidemic would have engulfed millions of Soviet citizens. It would have been just some kind of Armageddon, for sure. Now, it seems to Deruzhinsky that someone's malicious intent was present in the events of 1518, especially since in the ideas of people in that area, the constant dance was considered as a kind of punishment or a curse. At the level of suggestion, someone suggested a model of behavior to go out into a crowded place and dance to his death. And when people were taken away from the one who suggested it, they immediately recovered, as Frau Trophea immediately recovered, being sent to another place. In general, something similar often happened in medieval Europe, as, for example, the story about the Pied Piper from the German city of Hamelin, when, too, with the help of some suggestion, the Pied Piper took 130 children without a trace. And this is the same manipulation of the consciousness of the inhabitants. As revenge on the ungrateful townspeople, the Pied Piper most likely brought the children into the swamp. And how did the Pied Piper manage the rats, if you remember that famous story? With the help of some unknown suggestion. In principle, we can agree with the definition of mass hysteria, but with the essential clarification that it is controlled and deliberately caused by someone. We've seen this in totalitarian countries like Nazi Germany, Communist China and Russia and other places. And there are people who know how to manipulate. But it's not only in such countries that this happens. There are other examples if you look at the world around you. Unfortunately, I believe Jim Jones in the United States and the movement of people that he basically abducted with his ideas of suggestion, or the various cults. Well, I won't get into that. I just wanted to talk about 1518. Dzerzhinsky also said that there is a possibility that Frau Trophea herself was the source of the epidemic. Perhaps she was not even aware of her psychic abilities to influence others. After all, as soon as she, with whom it all began, was cured and stopped going crazy, so to say, the whole epidemic immediately stopped. And of course, it is impossible to exclude the hypothesis that she organized everything herself, being what they called at the time a witch or a psychic, because sometimes people have psi ability and they just don't realize what they have, because as you know, most of us do not use our brains to their full potentials. So I really appreciate your attention to my work, and I'll bring you more interesting videos. And if you can support me, please look at the links in the description to this video. Please subscribe to my channel and tell others, and like it. Thank you.